Yeah. First, let me say something about Freakin' Candy's book. I do not recommend that book. Prefer that no one ever read it. It's only marginally better than Percy Graves' work. Criticisms of his 16 Crucified Saviors, which you can find at the secular web, apply almost as much to Freakin' Candy. Their research is on key parts it's shoddy, and their source citations minimal and problematic. There's no way to know when they've gotten something right or wrong without redoing all their research, which makes their book useless. And that's the same complaint I had against Graves' book. To figure out what's in there that's even correct, you have to completely redo the whole work, and why even read the book if you're just going to do all the work yourself anyway?
Well, I've done a count recently of 1,200 sources on the resurrection, everything published since 1975 in German, French, and English. And I went back and I looked how many of these scholars who hold university chairs, for example, how many of them who are not Christians, who do not hold to the resurrection, how many of them would say that in any way the mystery gods are a potential inspiration for Christianity? And I can count the number of skeptics on one hand. I can count them on one hand out of 1,200 scholars.
It is true that accounts exist of pagan gods who rose from the dead. However, none of these predate Christianity. None of them are contemporary with Jesus. In fact, the first doesn't occur until Adonis, one of the pagan gods, and he is about 150. Now, the religion of Adonis is much older than Christianity. It predates Jesus. But the part about Adonis coming back from the dead postdates Jesus by about 120 years. And he's the earliest. So, who's copying who if we're going to say someone's copying?
The first section of the hit film Zeitgeist proposes a theory that many people have accepted without proper investigation. This theory is as follows. An ancient brotherhood assembled the Old and New Testament based on astrotheology and pagan myth. This theory purports that the historical Jesus didn't actually exist, but was an assemblage of pagan deities and astrological symbology. This film is going to thoroughly refute the theory and put it to rest once and for all. Before we begin though, you must realize that the Zeitgeist view is a real minority view. I contacted the noted scholar Mike Lacona to get his conclusion on the belief Zeitgeist offers. His response is as follows. There are as many non-Christian sources who mention Jesus within 150 years of his life as there are who mention the Roman emperor contemporary with Jesus' ministry within 150 years of his life. Those who propose that Jesus never existed must reasonably account for these sources, while those who try to believe their arguments are reasonable, they have not convinced many. In fact, I am not aware of a single widely respected scholar in the world who holds the position that Jesus never existed. Even critical atheist scholars such as Richard Carrier and Dr. Bob Price have rejected Zeitgeist sources such as Acharya S.'s The Christ Conspiracy and Percy Graves' 16 Crucified Saviors. As Dr. Bob Price remarks, she is quick to state as bald fact what turn out to be, once one chases down her sources, either wild speculation or complex inference from a chain of complicated data open to many interpretations. One of the most intriguing claims made repeatedly in these books is that among the mythical predecessors of Jesus as a crucified god were the Buddha, the blue-skinned Krishna, and Dionysus. Is there any basis to these claims which Murdoch just drops like a ton of bricks? Again, she does not explain where they come from, much less why no available book on Buddha, Krishna, or Dionysus contains a crucifixion account. When Murdoch speaks of the Christ Conspiracy, she means it. She really believes that people got together and cooked up early Christianity like a network sitcom. Richard Carrier states, the world's 16 crucified saviors, or Christianity before Christ, is unreliable, but no comprehensive critique exists. Most scholars immediately recognize many of his findings as unsupported and dismiss Graves as useless. Graves often does not distinguish his opinions and theories from what his sources and evidence actually state. Graves does little or no source analysis or formal textual criticism. Now that you have a brief understanding of what Christian and non-Christian scholars think of Zeitgeist, let's examine the film's claims of these supposed similarities to Jesus. They first bring up Horus. Now, December 25th is of no relevance because the New Testament does not mention the date. Most scholars hold that Jesus was born in the spring. It wasn't until halfway through the 4th century that December 25th was added by the Roman Catholic Church. This says nothing about Christian origins because Christianity was around for roughly 300 years already. Moreover, nowhere in the Egyptian record does it specify the birth date of Horus, son of Isis and Osiris. Mere speculation is offered for the birth date of the other Horuses. There is no evidence that Isis was a virgin in the myth. The onus of proof is on Zeitgeist. Seth dismembered Osiris, then Isis put his dead body back together and had intercourse with it. In some versions, she used a handmade phallus since she wasn't able to find that part of her husband, so it was not a virgin birth. In the original story it says, quote, "She drew from him his essence according to a hymn to Osiris and the legend of the origin of Horus. Since she drew from him his essence or sperm, there is no virgin birth." As Egyptian scholar Richard Wilkinson remarks, through her magic, Isis revivified the sexual member of Osiris and became pregnant by him, eventually giving birth to their child Horus, unquote. And as Franco's Dunand urges, quote, "After having sexual intercourse, in the form of a bird, with the dead god she restored to life, she gave birth," unquote. This does not constitute as a parallel if you know the New Testament. Since this is so weak, Acharya S. claims Isis is the constellation of Virgo, the Virgin. When pressed for documentation, no substantiation is offered for the Isis-Virgo connection at all. In regard to Isis being called Isis Mary, I could find no scholarly information to substantiate this. I went to Graves' work to see if that's what Acharya was referencing. Graves writes, "The Virgin with her God-begotten child, they are represented on the Hindu zodiac and on the ancient Egyptian planispheres," unquote. So in other words, Acharya assumes because Isis is Horus's mother, and because Virgo is in the zodiac, therefore Isis is a virgin. This is so dishonest and in no way makes Isis' name Isis Mary. Another alternative was raised in a dialogue I had with a Zeitgeist defender. He claimed her name was Mayurt in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I went to Alfred Wiedemann, an expert Egyptologist who wrote Religion of the Ancient Egyptians. He writes, "Come at all, I am the cow Mayurt." The effect, the writing was made by the cow, Isis, as identified with Mayurt, for her son Horus. Mayurt is the celestial cow, the goddess who gave birth to the sky when nothing else existed. That is where the idea of Isis Mary comes from. Again, it has nothing to do with the name Mary in the Bible, and Mayurt isn't even spelled similar to Mary, and it doesn't even sound the same. All Zeitgeist is doing here is playing word games. As for the Star in the East claim, since there is no such myth in the Horus story, Acharya goes to astrotheology and claims that the 3 stars in Orion's belt align with Sirius, or the supposed star in the east on December 25th, which in turn point to the sun's birth, or Horus's birth. First, there is no evidence the ancient Egyptians interpreted the occurrence and assigned it to Horus's birth. Secondly, her thesis is false in that it is impossible for the sun to align with Sirius and the 3 stars in Orion on December 25th because they are not above the horizon at the same time. But even if she was right, and they all aligned on December 25th, and the Egyptian Horus story refers to this as an account of his birth, since the Bible says Jesus was born in the spring and doesn't number the wise men, it makes it irrelevant. There was a form of Horus the child, but there is no mention of Horus being a prodigal teacher in Massey's summary. Isis just hid Horus. The only time the age 12 is even relevant at all is that the child passes from adolescence to adulthood. There is no bibliographic data suggesting Horus began any sort of ministry at all, much less at the age of 30. As for baptism by Anup, the claim comes from the book Ancient Egypt, The Light of the World by Massey, page 795, which reads, "Look upon me, O ye great and mighty gods, who are foremost among the spirits of Anu. Let me be exalted in your presence. Lo, I come that I may purify this soul of mine in the most high degree. Let not the impediment which cometh from your mouth be issued against me. Let me be purified in the lake of Epiquas. Let me plunge into the divine pool beneath the 2 divine Sycamaros of heaven and earth," unquote. Baptism by Anup is never actually depicted or carried out and thus never mentioned. It is simply a product of ad lib or superimposing onto the actual story. Notice all that it says is Horus is asking for edification and forgiveness. This is merely an example of amplification of what the Egyptian glyph chronicles. The source citation is therefore inadequate. The original source that mentions Anup the Baptizer is not Egyptian, it is Gerald Massey. Massey never mentions where this name is mentioned in any Egyptian text. The fact is that Anup the Baptizer does not exist in any Egyptian text whatsoever. The name Anup is a misspelling of the Egyptian Anubis. He never baptized Horus in any Egyptian text. Anubis wasn't even a baptizer, he was an embalmer. He was a great protector of God, guiding the soul through the underworld, and is usually depicted as a jackal-headed or wild dog-headed man, or a reclining black jackal. I don't see any parallel to Matthew which says, "Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, 'I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?' Jesus replied, 'Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness.' Jesus was baptized because he had to fulfill the legal requirements for entering into priesthood. The supposed unverified text does not even state Horus was 30 when baptized, or even objectively baptized at all for that matter. It's just unreliable and subjective. As Dr. William Lane Craig notes, we find almost no trace of cults of dying and rising gods in 1st century Palestine, unquote. So if these cults weren't even in 1st century Palestine, how would the early church construct baptism based on Horus? Until and unless the zeitgeist people verify the presence in 1st century Palestine and gain a consensus on the supposed baptism of Horus, I cannot accept this thesis. Massey is unreliable and rejected by modern scholarship. Zeitgeist claims Horus had 12 disciples. Horus had 16 followers, a group of followers called Mensu, and 4 disciples called Hero Shemzu. Since you cannot find 12 disciples in the Horus myth, Acharya then turns to the zodiac calendar as evidence. This is all based off the assumption that the Egyptians saw 12 signs as Horus's disciples, which there is no evidence of. The sun does pass through the 12 signs, but Jesus does not pass through his 12 disciples in any fashion similar to the zodiac. If the Bible was based off the zodiac, we would expect to see the similar movement through the disciples. AnsweringInfidels.com reports, the 12 apostles were most certainly assigned because of the 12 tribes of Judah. Skeptics might say that the 12 tribes of Judah were based off the zodiac, but the division of the 12 signs of the zodiac didn't occur until the 5th century BC, well after the 12 tribes. It seems then the only evidence that Acharya has is the number 12. As Mike Lacona states, quote, Miss Murdoch also holds that when we see 12 figures in the Bible, that these are representative of the 12 zodiac signs. She writes, in reality, it is no accident that there are 12 patriarchs, 12 tribes of Israel, and 12 disciples, 12 being the number of astrological signs. If we want to accept her thoughts on this, we also need to accept that Dunkin' Donuts is owned by an astrologer, since they give a discount when you buy a dozen donuts. Grocery stores are also run by astrologers, since you buy eggs by the dozen. Even our legal system must be influenced by astrology, since there are 12 jurors. When you want to see astrology in something, you see it, even when it requires that you read in foreign meanings into the text. We also have numerous evidence for the original disciples of Jesus. For example, towards the end of the 1st century, Clement writes, quote, Peter through unrighteous envy endured not 1 or 2, but numerous labors, and when he had at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him, unquote. In regard to miracles, there is some magic associated with Horus, but this is with Horus the child, not Horus the elder or his adult forms. He was known for warding off dangerous creatures such as crocodiles and other beasts. Horus on the crocodile was a common manifestation of the importance of the Horus healing ritual. The healing of Horus from scorpion stings by Isis is noted. Power of healing seems to come from his mother Isis, who is indeed the goddess of immense magical power. He never exorcised demons or raised his father from the dead. Not one miracle that Jesus did can be found in the Horus story. Horus never walked on water, he was merely thrown in the water, and because of this fact, defenders of Zeitgeist say that he was in the sky, and the sky looks like water. This is just pathetic and not even worth responding to, though. There is no evidence for the titles Zeitgeist listed. The forms of Horus are Horus the child, magical titles such as Horus on the crocodile, Horus as the son of Isis and Osiris, pillar of his mother, and Horus as the sun god, lord of the sky, god of the east, Horus of the horizon, and later associated with Ra. God's anointed son, the son of man, good shepherd and lamb of God, word made of flesh, and the word of truth, the way, the truth, and the light, and Messiah are not recognized as Horus titles by any Egyptologist. Messiah seems suspicious since it is Hebrew in origin, and the title the way, the truth, and the light does not even exist in the Bible. John 14 verse 6 says the way, the truth, and the life, not light. Since this title is not attributed to the Horus story, my hypothesis is that Zeitgeist, or one of Zeitgeist's sources, simply made it up, not knowing what John 14 verse 6 really said. Horus wasn't crucified, buried for 3 days, or resurrected. Horus had one of his eyes ripped out, but he was not killed. It was his father Osiris who was killed, dismembered, reconstructed, and revived by Isis, his magical mother. Horus was never crucified. There's an unofficial story in which he dies and is cast into pieces into the water, and then later fished out by a crocodile at Isis' request. This unofficial story is the only one in which he dies at all. He becomes merged with Ra, which meant rebirth of the sun in the east, and it is based on the cycles of nature, not any sort of historical claims, unlike the story of Jesus, and it does not constitute as a crucifixion and resurrection. And even in this death, there are no references to a tomb anywhere. Ra and Horus never completely merged into a single falcon-headed sun god. It made Ra into Horus, who was the son of Ra. It made Ra his own son and father. Another source notes a story where Horus is bitten by a snake and revived, which still is not much of a parallel at all. It seems like a desperate attempt to make a connection, mere biased pattern searching, with the intent of finding similarity. Poor judgment and unreliable criteria. Zeitgeist explains, quote, "The images begin with Thoth announcing to the Virgin Isis that she will conceive Horus, then Meth, the Holy Ghost, impregnating the Virgin, then the virgin birth, and the adoration," unquote. This is what Zeitgeist claims. In regard to the inscription and Zeitgeist's interpretation, I contacted Dr. John Baines, professor of Egyptology at Oxford University. He states, quote, "The reliefs you mention show the conception and birth of the future king after the creator god, Amen, Ra, has taken on the form of the existing king to impregnate the queen. There are links, but they are very far apart. Your source is a very long way off that, and several of the statements it makes are wrong," unquote. Then I contacted Janet Johnson, PhD, professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago. She remarks, quote, "The scene showing the god Amen visiting the queen mother to impregnate her with the future ruler, in this case Queen Hatshepsut, a Christian interpretation just doesn't work," unquote. I then contacted Victor Blunden of Manchester University and Liverpool University, and of Ancient Egypt magazine. He states, quote, "I have heard mention of this film before, and though I haven't seen it myself, I understand that it contains many misinterpretations and distortions of the actual Egyptian textual and relief material to get its message across. Egyptian kings were believed to be semi-divine beings, the son of an Egyptian god by a human mother. Thus the relief refers to King Amenophis III and not to Horus. Though kings could sometimes be said to be the incarnation of the gods due to another Egyptian myth, this is where the confusion may have come in. The reliefs actually refer to the conception of the king, showing he was born of a human mother, the Queen of Egypt, by the god Amen. It was not seen as an immaculate conception, as the queen was impregnated by the god Amen. This is not the Virgin Isis, but the Queen of Egypt depicted, and by this time she was not a virgin, as she had sex. The second scene clearly shows a pregnant queen, Metumwea, standing between two Egyptian gods. The scene generally shows the baby infant being presented to the other Egyptian gods, and finally being presented to the god Amen, who acknowledges that the child is his true son, and thus the future king of Egypt. Thus, the interpretation of this scene by the film Zeitgeist appears totally wrong, as it imposes Christian values and interpretations on a typical scene showing the divine conception of an Egyptian king. The god Horus is not mentioned here. Isis is not depicted as far as I can see. There are no 3 kings or magi bearing gifts, which is total fabrication and quite out of context in this Egyptian myth," unquote. I then contacted the scholar William Gordon of the UCLA. He remarks, quote, "That is a very, very liberal interpretation of the divine birth. This scene assuredly does not comment on the queen's status as a virgin. I think the interpretation of the scene that you describe from the documentary takes the divine birth and runs with it, taking it in directions that are not warranted by the evidence," unquote. I then contacted the Egyptologist Dr. Rhonda Balai, PhD from Yale. She states, quote, "In the scene he impregnates the queen who was a married lady, not the goddess Isis. To conclude, the woman impregnated was neither the goddess Isis or a virgin, but the queen who had been married to the king for a while. The scene shows a divine birth with the aid of the 7 Hathors, or cows, that were the hippo goddess and the Maskenet, the frog goddess." Scholars disagree with Zeitgeist. So who was this Gerald Massey that Zeitgeist cites anyway? Gerald Massey was a practicing Druid. In fact, Massey was elected chosen chief of the most ancient order of Druids from 1880 through 1906, so he was a chief Druid. The ancient historian Tacitus tells us this about the Druids, quote, "Deemed it indeed a duty to cover their altars with the blood of the captives and to consult their deities through human entrails," unquote. Yes, Massey seems like a great source. In fact, most of Zeitgeist sources have interesting backgrounds. Next, Zeitgeist brings up Attis. Again, December 25th is irrelevant to origins. Zeus ejaculated on a mountain, and from this arises a wild creature named Aegisthus. No one liked this repulsive Aegisthus, so he gets put to sleep. While he is asleep, Dionysus ties a rope around his genitals, ties the other end of the rope to a tree. From the resulting blood, an almond seed springs up, and then a long time thereafter, Nana picks some fruit and the almond and puts it on her lap, and then it disappears, upon which she finds herself pregnant with Attis. So in short, Attis was conceived from an almond seed which fell from a tree as a result of Aegisthus's blood, who was made from Zeus's sperm hitting a mountain. No texts make the claim that Nana was a virgin. Parallel to Christianity? No way. More desperate exaggeration. Crucified, dead for 3 days, and resurrected? Not even close. In one story, Attis is getting married. Then Aegisthus shows up at the wedding. He is angry. The bride dies. Attis then gets upset, falls under a pine tree, and then he removes his own genitalia and dies. Aegisthus, witnessing this, feels sad and asks Zeus to do something about it. Zeus decides to preserve Attis. His hair continues to grow, and his little finger moves continuously. Is this a crucifixion, 3-day death and resurrection? Not at all. To claim this would be disingenuous to the viewer. Another version states, Sybil falls in love with Attis, but Attis prefers a nymph. Sybil kills the nymph. Attis goes insane, removes his genitalia. From his blood, flowers grow out of the ground, and he turns into a pine tree. Is this a crucifixion, 3-day death and resurrection? No, of course not. Another legend states Sybil is the daughter of a king. She marries Attis. When the king finds out, he kills Attis and makes sure his body is never found. Where is Christ's story in any of these imaginary legends? As the Princeton theologian John Gresham Machen points out, quote, "The myth contains no account of a resurrection. All that Sybil is able to obtain is that the body of Attis should be preserved, that his hair should continue to grow, and that his little finger should move," unquote. And as Dr. Ronald Nash explains, quote, "It was only during the later Roman celebrations after 300 AD of the spring festival that anything remotely connected with the resurrection appears. In truth, no clear-cut, unambiguous reference to the supposed resurrection of Attis appears, even in the very late literature from the 4th century after Christ. It is abundantly evident that Zeitgeist's view of Attis is erroneous and unintelligent, and for this reason no scholars will cite Zeitgeist as a reference, nor give it a good review." They bring up Krishna. Krishna was the 8th son of Princess Devaki. In regard to Krishna's supposed similar virgin birth, I contacted the distinguished Professor Vasudha Narayana, PhD, University of Bombay. I gave her an excerpt from the book The Christ Conspiracy and the book Sons of God. She said, quote, "I've never heard of Krishna being born of a virgin, either through Sanskrit or vernacular texts, or even folklore, and born on December 25th? Wow. The texts say explicitly he was born on the 8th day of the waning moon, in the month that now comes approximately between August 15th and September 14th, and to the best of my knowledge, his father was not a carpenter, more like a prince. I can't imagine why people would sit back and cook up all these conspiracies. I have no clue who Acharya S is. Acharya simply means teacher, and is frequently used for a male teacher," unquote. As Dr. Edwin M. Yamauchi states, quote, "Krishna was born to a mother who already had 7 previous sons, as even his followers concede," unquote. So no, he was not born of a virgin, as Zeitgeist claims. In regard to the Star in the East claim, it comes from one sentence in Graves' 16 Crucified Saviors, chapter 6. It reads, quote, "In the history of the Hindus, Savior Krishna, we are told that as soon as Narad, who having heard of his fame, had examined the stars, he declared him to be from God," unquote. Notice Zeitgeist says that the star in the east signals Krishna's coming, yet their own source says nothing of the sort. What their source says is that Krishna is already born. Narad hears of Krishna's fame and then looks up at the stars, not any star in the east, but all of them, and asserts he is from God. So no, his birth was not announced by a star in the east. Also, Graves doesn't cite any Hindu scripture, so he is most likely lying or using post-Christian sources. The only thing similar in the Hindu text referring to Krishna's birth and stars was from the Bhagavad Gita Purana 10:3 verse 1 to 5, which reads, "Then there was a supreme hour, all auspicious and most suitable, with the constellation of Rohini rising, and all the stars and planets in favorable position. Everywhere was peace, the multitude of stars twinkled in the sky, and the cities, towns, pastured grounds, and the miners were all at their best. The minds of the saintly oppressed, as they had been by the Asura, turning perfectly contented, when in the situation the kettle drums together resounded with the unborn one to be born," unquote. So the planets and stars were in favorable positions, and the multitude of stars twinkled in the sky. That says nothing of a star in the east announcing his birth, and besides, the Bhagavad Gita Purana was written way after the Gospels, so this could not have inspired Christianity. As for performing miracles, I can find no mention of miracles being performed by Krishna in the vicinity of either disciples or even his followers. But even if he did, claiming that it proves causation is like saying because Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946 and Lincoln in 1846, and that Kennedy became president in 1960 and Lincoln in 1860, therefore Kennedy never existed. It's the same kind of assertion. As for the resurrection, Dr. Edwin Bryant, professor of Hinduism at Rutgers University, remarks, quote, "Krishna was killed by an arrow from a hunter who accidentally shot him in the heel. He died and ascended. It was not a resurrection," unquote. And as Benjamin Walker in his book The Hindu World, an Encyclopedia Survey of Hinduism writes, quote, "There can be no doubt that the Hindus borrowed the tales from Christianity," unquote. These parallels come from the Bhagavad Gita Purana, which is dated from the 7th century AD to 11th century AD. As for the Haravamsa, it's dated from the 4th to the 6th centuries. In other words, these similarities only appear in Hinduism 250 to 950 years after the Gospels were written. The Hindus flat out copied Christianity and not vice versa. Zeitgeist is inadequate in explaining the truth of the matter, as is Acharya S. Here they are really showing their illogic. As Martin Palmer shows in his book The Jesus Sutras, Christian missions reached India and China early, around the 5th to 7th centuries. This explains the similarities that Hindus borrowed from Christianity. They bring up Dionysus. December 25th is of no relevance, and there seems to be no evidence Dionysus was born on December 25th in any scholarly literature. In fact, Freak and Gandhi note that his birth was celebrated on January 6th by some in Alexandria. Sometimes Dionysus is associated with the annual return of spring. As for the virgin birth, there's two versions, none of which constitute as a virgin birth. As Dr. Edwin Yamauchi proclaims, quote, "There's no evidence of a virgin birth for Dionysus. As the story goes, Zeus disguised himself as a human, fell in love with the princess Semele, the daughter of Cadmus, and she became pregnant. Hera, who was Zeus's queen, arranged to have her burned to a crisp, but Zeus rescued the fetus and sewed him into his thigh until Dionysus was born. So this is not a virgin birth in any sense," unquote. As the Encyclopedia Mythica notes, in that version, quote, "Zeus slept with Semele," unquote. No virgin birth. Another tale reads, Dionysus is the product of Zeus and Persephone. Hera becomes insanely jealous and tries to destroy the infant by sending the Titans to kill him. Zeus comes to the rescue, but it's too late. The Titans had eaten everything but Dionysus' heart. Zeus then takes the heart and implants it into the womb of Semele. As we can see, no virgin birth takes place, but this is how Dionysus is said to have become a rebirth deity, as is twice born in the womb. So Zeus mated with his daughter Persephone, who bore a son, Sagrius, which is another name for Dionysus. As we can see, there is no virgin birth here. More illogic from Zeitgeist. Zeitgeist says, quote, "He was a traveling teacher." Well, the story does have Dionysus traveling around Arabia, Persia, and Greece, spreading his rights and delivering judgments as needed on those who defy. Reports that there are versions of Dionysus which have him traveling the world, including an expedition to India. Dionysus is sometimes referred to as the most epidemic of gods, for he was the god who spent the most time traveling. This is nothing like Jesus traveling a limited area providing moral teachings, but at any rate, There would be no other way to spread the word unless you wanted to travel or else sent disciples around, which Jesus did do, but Dionysius did not. He was never believed to be a spiritual teacher like Jesus. This parallel is very weak. Jesus' miracles were healings and such, all positive miracles. Dionysius' miracles were judgments against those who defied him. Zeitgeist claims, quote, he performed miracles such as turning water into wine, unquote. Though there are tales where Dionysius supernaturally fills empty vessels with wine, the act of turning water into wine does not occur. The motif of changing water to wine is not presented in the Dionysius legends. The jugs of Elis, for example, were not filled with water, but were empty, and the fount of wine in Andros did not replace one of water. From these references, it is obvious that there are significant differences between Dionysius' legend and the story of John 2, as Dr. Donald A. Carson remarks, quote, older attempts to interpret this sign as a Christianized version of the Dionysius myth or of related stories have largely been abandoned in the light of evidence that the alleged parallels are wholly inadequate, unquote. So I hope you all understand that when Zeitgeist claims Dionysius turned water into wine, that's just a flat-out lie. They claim he was referred to the quote-unquote King of Kings, Alpha and Omega, God's only begotten Son, etc. In Graves' World 16 Crucified Saviors, Chapter 9, Titles of Saviors, he doesn't even mention Dionysius once as having any similar title with Jesus. I went to Acharya's book, The Christ Conspiracy, which is basically just a rip-off of Graves' work for the most part, and found that she says, he was called King of Kings and God of Gods, but only considered the Alpha and Omega and only begotten Son. She provides no source for these titles, nor explains why Dionysius was called such things when the story doesn't even suit him. For example, King of Kings? Dionysius was only semi-deity. Zeus was the head god according to mythology, so he wasn't King of Kings. Only begotten Son? Zeus had many relationships with women, where he fathered several children. Alpha and Omega? Dionysius had a distinct beginning to his existence. It seems Acharya is not qualified to write on the subject and needs to cite more sources. As for the resurrection claim, in terms of rising from the dead, there have been a variety of ideas. One, a single inscription from Thasos that describes Dionysius as a god who renews himself and returns every year rejuvenated, whatever that means. We have no context with which to refer it. A story that Dionysius was chased and persecuted, and then descends to the depths of the Iconian Sea and to the land of the dead, also the heart rejuvenated above, which in another version has the heart placed in a body made of gypsum. In one version, which has Dionysius as son of Demeter, his mom resembles the pieces and makes Dionysius young again, which is an eccentric minority variant, not a resurrection. In others, it's simply said that Zeus raised him up as he lay mortally wounded, or that Zeus swallowed the heart of Dionysius and then begat him afresh by Semele, or the heart was pounded up and given in a potion to Semele, who thereby conceived him. With such a variety of options, it may be no surprise that at least one variant bears a superficial resemblance to what happened to Jesus, rising from the dead and ascending to heaven. This merely displays mere pattern searching and in no way proves causation. Taken together with all the debunked information, if this is all they have, it no way proves causation. One must simply use logic. The resurrection account of Dionysius stems from the tale of him being reborn after his attack by the Titans. As we can see, this has nothing to do with the resurrection story of Jesus. Furthermore, we are told after Dionysius completes teaching his followers his religious rites, he ascends to Mount Olympus to be with the other deities, alive and well. His infant rebirth, like Attis, is symbolic of the vegetation cycle, not atoning for sin. Is there even any evidence that these supposed resurrection ideas predate Christianity? Let's listen to Dr. Gary Habermas's dialogue with the Zeitgeist defender named Tim Callahan of Skeptic magazine.
I want to say, where's the evidence?
Well, I would say that, first of all, that the myth of Dionysus probably does antedate Jesus. And yes, there isn't specifically resurrection, specifically, I'm meaning crucifixion, but I don't see that that's really that important a point. They all undergo a horrible, excruciating death.
You're going to have to give me a date for the earliest inscription, because Dionysus, I don't know anybody who thinks Dionysus is pre-Christian, not the resurrection portion.
Okay, well, all I can tell you is that the myth is that he is torn apart by the Titans, eaten, and he is raised from the dead.
But what is the date?
I don't know the date. I don't know the date of the, as I said, of the original as far as any writings we have. But I know that with the myths, the Greek myths, most of our Greek myths we do have from later collections, except we know they were told earlier because we have the vase paintings depicting them going way back in time.
But the question is there a resurrection? And since we don't have any resurrection predating the 2nd century all the way to the 4th century are the earliest ones, 2nd to 4th, we can say, well, maybe there's a resurrection there, but there's no data. There's absolutely no evidence for that position.
Dionysus was not a savior to which if you followed him, you would get eternal life. As the French scholar André Boulanger concludes, quote, "The conception that the god dies and is resurrected in order to lead his faithful to eternal life is represented in no Hellenistic mystery or religion," unquote. As we have just heard, the skeptic Tim Callahan admits there's no crucifixion with Dionysus. So what about the picture of the amulet of Dionysus that Zeitgeist shows when introducing him and that Freak and Gandhi have on their book cover? The amulet dates centuries after the Gospel and may even be a forgery. James Hannam conducted research on the amulet. He writes, quote, "The first source Freak and Gandhi supplied was R. Eisler, Orpheus the Fisher, first published in 1920, and where the 4th century date for the amulet is given, and it is illustrated. The second reference was W.K.C. Guthrie, Orpheus and Greek Religion, Princeton University Press, 1952. This is the 2nd edition and discusses the amulet at some length on page 265. He mentions the views of Eisler and Otto Kern, who was a very distinguished German expert on the Orpheus. At the time, both considered the gem to be an ancient Orphic artifact, and Eisler suggested there was a tradition of a crucified Orpheus. Pointing to the evidence of Justin Martyr, who denies there was ever a crucified pagan, Guthrie rightly rejects this interpretation. But there's a final kicker to this story that Freak failed to mention. I found an endnote to the 1952 edition of Guthrie's work, page 278, which states, "In his review of the book, Orpheus and Greek Religion, Kern recants and expresses himself, convinced by the expert opinion of Rael and Zahn, that the gem is a forgery. The gem has been branded a forgery by noted experts. Luckily for Freak and Gandhi, that they don't think the gem is important to their thesis. But you still have to ask, what is it doing on the front cover of their book? And one can also have suspicions as to why they didn't give a reference to where the picture came from," unquote. This just displays the dishonesty of Zeitgeist, Freak, and Gandhi, and how inadequate their research abilities are. Anything to make a few dollars, I guess. They bring up Mithra. As for December 25th, it is irrelevant to origins. Zeitgeist claims, quote, "Mithra was born of a virgin," and Acharya S. even claims that Mithra was born in a cave. Now, the vast majority of data on Mithra comes from artwork. Mithra was portrayed as having emerged from a rock and being fully grown or fully mature once born, not being born in a cave, and it's not by a virgin or anything similar to the baby Jesus in any stretch of the imagination. And even if Mithra was born in a cave, there's no mention of Jesus being born in a cave anywhere. As the late Dr. Ronald Nash puts it, quote, "Mithra was supposedly born when he emerged from a rock," unquote. So unless the rock is considered a virgin, this parallel evaporates. As for the 12 disciples claim, Mithra had a number of animal companions, a snake, a dog, a lion, a scorpion, but not 12 of them. The Iranian Mithras had one follower named Varunu, and the Roman Mithra had 2 companions named Catus and Ketapatris. I emailed Acharya about one of her articles that said there was a scene of Mithra with 12 disciples. She did not respond to me. My attention was brought to J.P. Holdings' article on Mithra, and it turns out his readers had also tried to reach Acharya, but received no response, even though she had responded regarding something else a short time before. Holding thinks that she might be referring to a scene with 2 vertical rows with 6 pictures of what seem to be human figures, and Mithra in the middle. Acharya now acknowledges that they are the zodiac signs. Here we go again with the zodiac. Then there are other carvings which have Mithra standing inside of the zodiac signs, but have other beings beside the signs, which would make him have 13 to 22 followers. There is no evidence that the Mithra cult thought of them as his disciples, as no inscriptions are in the reliefs. It could mean anything. There's certainly no text saying they are 12 disciples. Upon close examination of the first picture, there's 15 figures surrounding Mithra anyway, not 12. And it's from the 2nd century AD, not 12. And it's from the 2nd century AD, and the second relief has 20 persons in it. Then out of desperation, on an internet article called Mithra and the 12, she is now saying that, quote, "The motif of the 12 disciples or followers in a Last Supper is recurrent in the pagan world, including with Mithraism," unquote. She doesn't elaborate on it or anything. She cites an Amazon link that's something called Jesus, A Kingdom Without Frontiers, The Last Supper, which is an animated children's VHS movie that has nothing to do with Mithra. So no, Mithra did not have 12 disciples, or a Last Supper with 12 disciples. Freaking Gandhi try to make excuses but have inadequate sources who make unsubstantiated claims and who speak of things outside of their field. Franz Commont's outdated theory is claiming that the figures were actually Mithra's 12 disciples dressed up in zodiac costumes. How they can make this connection is unknown, as no inscriptions accompany the original reliefs. There's just no evidence for those type of fringe claims. The relief Acharya refers to in regard to a supposed Last Supper with 12 is just some kind of banquet with 6 figures, not 12, and there's no evidence that it was any kind of Last Supper, as no texts go with it. The closest thing is a celebration of a meal Mithra had with the sun god after slaying the bull, but nowhere is this called a Last Supper. But since all throughout history people had supper at a table most of the time and not alone, I don't see carvings portraying eating as any kind of evidence. As for performing miracles, the idea that Jesus' miracles were inspired by Mithra's miracles is rather ridiculous, since Mithra never did anything which equates to Jesus' miracles, such as walking on water, raising the dead, or calming the storms. This could not be called a significant comparison. Zeitgeist says, quote, "Upon his death he was buried for 3 days and thus resurrected," unquote. There's no mention of Mithra dying at all until the 4th century, and Richard Gordon says directly that there is, quote, "no death of Mithras." That's just nonsense. The only reference I could find was every year during the winter solstice he was supposedly reborn out of a rock, but this tale was added later and doesn't involve a tomb or a resurrection, but a rebirth, and it's post-Christian. As Dr. Ronald Nash affirms, quote, "no claim can be made that Mithras was a dying and rising god," unquote. As for the titles Zeitgeist claims, he was referred to as the Light and the Truth. In Kersey Graves' The World's 16 Crucified Saviors, Chapter 9, Titles and Saviors, he doesn't even mention Mithra as being called the Truth or Light. Acharya claims he is, but cites nothing. She doesn't even say he was actually called these things, she just said he was considered the Truth and the Light. She does not explain why he was considered these things or give any sort of documentation to support it. She just claims that's what he was considered. So what about the astrological claims in Zeitgeist? Was Jesus' birth really just an astrological event?
One of the primary claims of astrotheology is that on December 24th, the 3 stars in Orion's belt align with the star Sirius, and that on December 25th, they all point to the rising sun. Astrotheology claims that the Christmas story is in fact allegory for this astronomical event. They say that the 3 stars in Orion's belt are the 3 wise men, and that they're following Sirius, the star in the east, to the birth of the sun on December 25th. There are several problems with this theory, but the main one, I feel, is that this astronomical event happens nothing like the way that they are presenting here. You can verify this with a simple astronomy program. This image is what it would have looked like 2,000 years ago on Christmas Day in Egypt. You'll first notice that there is no sign of Orion or of Sirius pointing to the sunrise as they have depicted so many times. If we take away the sunlight, you can see to the right of your screen Sirius. Orion is already on the other side of the horizon before the sun rises. This scenario happens much more, like they say, in different months, like almost any day in October. You can see that as the sun is just about to cross the horizon, you see the stars in Orion's belt and Sirius pointing directly to it. The same thing with almost any day in November. It looks much more like the 3 stars and Sirius are pointing to the rising sun. In fact, it's by December 25th that Orion is completely below the horizon before the sun rises. And to make matters worse for astrotheology, due to precession, which occurs on roughly a 1.25 degree per 100-year timescale, it would mean that 2,000 years ago, Orion would have set about 2 hours earlier, even further before the sunrise. Some proponents of astrotheology claim that on December 24th, Sirius aligns with the 3 stars in Orion's belt. But the problem is that this never changes, not on December 24th, or not any day in the 365 days a year. In fact, that's why the ancients called planets wandering stars, is because they would move in relation to the stars that would stay the same. This idea that Sirius aligns with the three kings on December 24th, just before the alignment with the sun on December 25th, is misleading at best, especially considering what they're trying to prove to you. There is an attempt by the proponents of astrotheology to try very hard to make the three stars in Orion's belt equal the Magi of the Bible. They've tried all kinds of different ways. Acharya S., a very big proponent of astrotheology, even claims that early Christians called the three stars in Orion's belt the Magi, although she offers no reference for this claim. People have called them the three kings before, but you must realize that if you were to call the three stars in Orion's belt the three kings, it would have absolutely nothing to do with the Bible. For one reason, that there are not three kings in the Christmas story, but wise men, quite different than kings. In addition, there are not three of them. The wise men are not numbered in the Bible, contrary to what most people think. There is also a lot of deception by omission in this story. For example, they would never cite why the star led the wise men first to King Herod and then to the birthplace of Jesus. There's no place for those details in this model, and so they simply don't tell you about it. Moving on. We'll turn to the movie Zeitgeist to explain the general concepts of astrotheology about these two following astronomical claims.
From the summer solstice to the winter solstice, the days become shorter and colder. And from the perspective of the northern hemisphere, the sun appears to move south and get smaller and more scarce. The shortening of the days and the expiration of the crops when approaching the winter solstice symbolize the process of death to the ancients. It was the death of the sun. And by December 22nd, the sun's demise was fully realized, makes it to its lowest point in the sky. Here a curious thing occurs. The sun stops moving south, at least perceivably, for 3 days. And during this 3-day pause, the sun resides in the vicinity of the Southern Cross, or Crux, constellation. And after this time, on December 25th, the sun moves 1 degree, this time north, foreshadowing longer days, warmth, and spring. And thus it was said, the sun died on the cross, was dead for 3 days, only to be resurrected or born again.
This is a series of provable lies. You can download any astronomy program and find this out for yourself. You can go back to 0 AD, or any time really, and find that when the sun rises, it is nowhere near the Southern Cross. And the idea that the sun rises in the Southern Cross constellation at that time or any time is absolutely ridiculous. The Southern Cross is perpendicular to the Earth's rotation and orbit, so this will never happen. In addition, if the sun ever rose in the constellation of the Southern Cross, it would be a zodiac sign. That's how they came up with them. And there's a few more problems. I'll read now from a website called Preventing Truth Decay. Dr. Noel Swerdlow is a professor of astronomy and astrophysics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Swerdlow specialized in the study of the practice of astronomy in antiquity through the 17th century. Dr. Swerdlow writes the following: the stars of the Southern Cross are just visible above the southern horizon in Alexandria and in Jerusalem in antiquity, although I don't think it is visible there now. The constellation was, however, not recognized in antiquity. Why wasn't the Southern Cross constellation recognized in antiquity? Dr. Swerdlow explains. That crux, the Southern Cross, was not recognized as a separate constellation in antiquity, probably because, as seen from the Mediterranean, it is low on the southern horizon, and is surrounded on all 3 sides by the stars of Centaurus, which is a large, prominent constellation. And the 4 bright stars of the crux are included as the stars of Centaurus. So its recognition had to wait until the southern voyages of the 16th century. I would also like to point out that it was the Romans that invented crucifixion. So if the ancients were pointing to a cross in the sky as some sort of symbol of death, it suggests they somehow were anticipating the Roman invention that would happen much, much later. On the point of the sun staying almost fixed for 3 days, on the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of December, I'll read from badastronomy.com. Although the sun does hang out to the south at winter solstice, it does not hang for just 3 days. You could pick 4 or more days and not notice much change. However, if 3 days was preferred for some reason, then it wouldn't be the days they claim, 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. Since the solstice is on the 22nd at 6 a.m., then it would be the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd as the most southern 3 days. This is a good opportunity to try to explain what's going on here, because if you understand the concept I'm about to say, then a lot of this is going to all of a sudden make sense to you. First, you have to understand that sun worship has been around for a long time, but usually it's not exactly them worshiping the sun, but something that the sun represents. Now, you have to understand that those people took over Christianity 400 years after trying to completely destroy it. Rome, all of a sudden, had a change of heart, and then became Christianity, or rather, this monster that said that they were Christianity. And they chose a date for the birthday of Jesus. And the date that they chose was chosen because of its connection to the sun. They did other things too. This is also when you start to find depictions of Jesus with halos and other obvious references to the zodiac and sun worship. You have to understand that this stuff doesn't prove that Jesus was a sun god. It only proves that sun worshippers were paying artists to depict Jesus more to their liking. There's a lot more to talk about this astrotheology, but we'll save that for other parts. But I do want to say this. There's not a clear definition. I know that Acharya S. on a recent movie has alluded to the fact that the reason that there's no Wikipedia entry for astrotheology is because of censorship, because it's somehow the theology no one wants you to know about. Well, I'll suggest that the reason that there's no Wikipedia entry is because there's no information on it. I would think that the Wikipedia entry would go something like this. Astrotheology is a term that Jordan Maxwell came up with out of absolutely nowhere, and Michael Tsarian started selling books and DVDs and $75 I Love Astrotheology t-shirts. I'll leave you with this. The main cheerleaders for astrotheology always tell us to do our homework, yet they're telling us lies that could only work if we're completely ignorant to the facts. So I just wanted to point out that this can all be stopped by us becoming more informed. Stop being walked all over by the mystery schools and told what to think and told who to hate. It's not up to them to tell you who to hate. They're using 2-bit, half-assed lies to do so. Stand up and say you're not going to take this anymore.
In the age section of the film, they claim that it is the astrological age that is referenced throughout the New Testament. They also mention Taurus as the age of the bull. They cite the Old Testament story about the ancient Israelites making a golden calf in Exodus 32 to support this assertion, that the Israelites were somehow associated with the age of Taurus. He says, quote, "The golden bull was really Taurus the bull, and Moses represents the new age of Aries, the ram. Jesus ushered in the age of Pisces, or the age of 2 fish, unquote. Then Aquarius with Luke 22 verse 10. They spend 5 long minutes on this, going through the Bible verses and giving their theory, and inducting people into the New Age movement, explaining how supposedly Aquarius is in the Bible as being an age, and the Jesus fish supposedly representing Pisces. Zeitgeist is fast to explain that, quote, "and ancient societies were very aware of this," unquote. They make sure to say that because their whole theory and that whole 5 minutes hinges on the idea that the ancients acknowledged the astronomical concept they refer to. If it turns out that this age concept is a modern concept, their whole theory falls apart, and that whole 5 minutes was a big waste of time. As Dr. Noel Swerdlow, the professor of astronomy and astrophysics at the University of Chicago, and who received the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, often referred to as the Genius Grant, remarks, quote, "The modern ideas about the age of Pisces or the age of Aquarius are based upon the location of the vernal equinox in the regions of the stars of those constellations, but the regions, the borders between. Those constellations are a completely modern convention of the International Astronomical Union for the purpose of mapping and never had any astrological significance. I hope this is helpful, although in truth what this woman is claiming is so wacky that it is hardly worth answering. So when this woman says that the Christian fish was a symbol of the coming age of Pisces, she is saying something that no one would have thought of in antiquity. To name another anachronism that appears to underline her interpretation, The borders of constellations between, say, Aries, Pisces, and Aquarius are modern conventions of the International Astronomical Union, and there is nothing ancient about them. Ancient astrologers did not use Norton's star atlas or anything else that drew arbitrary lines between sidereal constellations. The location of the equinox among one or another zodiacal constellation as the so-called age of Aquarius or age of Pisces is something of concern to modern astrology, but is never mentioned as significant in ancient astrology. It is simply anachronistic to believe that what is important to 20th century astrology was of importance to ancient astrology, unquote. This means Zeitgeist's argumentation regarding the various astrological ages is irrelevant. In other words, the ancient Christ conspirators could not have recognized the 12 celestial sections in order to incorporate them into a Christian myth and announce the ushering in of the age of Pisces, because the division into the celestial sections did not occur until a meeting of the International Astronomical Union in the 20th century. In regard to the Jesus fish, former professional astrologer for 8 years, Marcia Montenegro states, quote, "The fish was an early symbol of Christ because the Greek word based on the initials of Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, spelled fish." And last, Zeitgeist claims that Jesus' birth date is at the start of this age. However, again, the New Testament writers do not indicate the date of Jesus' birth. They next mention the supposed plagiarized story of Moses. They say, quote, "This baby in a basket story was lifted directly from the myth of Sargon of Akkad of around 2250 BC, unquote. Well, there are similarities, but dating is the major factor. Is it true that the Sargon story was dated from 2250 BC? Again, dating is the serious issue. The Moses story dates to 1400 BC. A few critics would say it's earlier. But on the other hand, the Sargon story lacks any obvious grammatical, lexicographical, or philological features that would allow precise dating. The initial date range is anywhere between 2039 to 627 BC, not 2250 BC as Zeitgeist claims. In favor of a late date, for example, are Neo-Assyrian orthographic forms. So in other words, the story of Sargon has a huge chance of being dated after 1400 BC, after the Moses story. Brian Lewis, author of the Sargon legend 1978, offers a suggestion that the story was written in the reign of Sargon II, a much later king, to legitimate his own rule. There are many similarities to the reign of Sargon II, which is dated later than Moses at around 721 to 705 BC. In any case, many conclude that there is no satisfactory reason to propose borrowing or fictionalization in either direction. The adoption of foundlings was a known and common practice in antiquity. Zeitgeist is being very disingenuous when they speak objectively concerning this. There is no precise date set to the Sargon story, and many even believe it's after Moses. Zeitgeist then goes to the numerous supposed lawgivers which they say Moses was based off of. They claim Manu, Minos, and Meses were lawgivers similar to Moses. These claims can be found on page 169 of Acharya S.'s The Christ Conspiracy, yet Acharya S. does not cite any primary sources, as usual. Her source is Deceptions and Myths of the Bible, 1991 by Lloyd Graham. But even the skeptic scholar Michael Lido concedes that this is not a credible source. Lido states, quote, "Graham's Deceptions and Myths of the Bible, I will concede, is a terrible source. Once I discovered how bad the source was, I had to edit the book prior to publishing," unquote. Regarding Meses, he states, quote, "I will not argue the Meses story," unquote. Since there are no primary texts offered to support this thesis, they have not made a case worth serious consideration. Manu is 1000 BC anyway. That's after Moses. Then they go on to the 10 Commandments and say they are taken outright from spell 125 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Then they list the similarities. Moses and the 10 Commandments dates approximately 1400 BC to not before 850 BC. Now, as far as spell 125, there are numerous authors and redactors over time. First written account is somewhere between 1550 to 950 BC. It is tenable that the 10 Commandments predate spell 125 or rival spell 125 in chronological history. The book has been altered hundreds if not thousands of times by various Egyptian clerics and royalty. This further exacerbates an effort to date the spell. However, perhaps it is more important to understand the differences between the two writings. The Ten Commandments represent a concise, positive imperative from God to man, and the life he should lead. Spell 125 represents a countless disarray of negative protestations by the already dead, a major difference. From a Christian worldview, it is not very surprising that many ancient cultures adhere to similar moral law code systems. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 2 verse 14 to 15, "When Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience bears witness." In other words, there is a universal moral law in the hearts of the Gentiles or non-Jews, implying that all humans deep down have a common concept of what is morally right and what is morally wrong. A good book is What We Can't Not Know, a Guide, 2003, written by J. Bud Suzuki. It focuses on the issue if you wish to gain a better understanding of this phenomenon. They then go to Justin Martyr, who was an early church father and a Christian apologist. He says, quote, "When we say that Jesus Christ was produced without sexual union, was crucified and died, and rose again, and ascended to heaven, we propound nothing new or different from what you believe regarding those whom you call the sons of Jupiter," unquote. Justin Martyr, First Apology. Here Justin is not admitting parallels, he is talking to the pagans, making it look as though there were parallels to avoid persecution from the Romans, since Rome did not object to paganism. As I have already demonstrated, the supposed parallels aren't even parallels, and Justin knew this. To prove Justin knew it wasn't true, listen to the following passage, quote, "But in no instance, not even in any of those so-called sons of Jupiter, did they imitate the being crucified, for it was not understood by them, all the things said of it having been put symbolically," unquote. There he admits there is no crucifixion. The historian must apply that to the quote zeitgeist notes, where he is trying to avoid persecution from Romans by saying crucifixion was common. Then they bring up the following from Justin, quote, "And if we even affirm that he was born of a virgin, accept this in common with what you accept of Perseus." In regard to this quote, Dr. John Gresham Machen of Princeton writes, quote, "When Justin refers to the birth of Perseus as a birth from or through a virgin, he is going beyond what the pagan sources contained. There seemed to be no clear evidence that pagan sources use the word virgin as referring to mothers of heroes, mythical or historical, who are represented as being begotten by the gods," unquote. In regard to the last quote, which reads, "For when they say that Dionysus arose again and ascended to heaven, is it not evident the devil has imitated prophecy?" Here Zeitgeist misunderstands Justin. Zeitgeist claims, quote, "The devil had the foresight to come before Christ and create his characteristics in the pagan world," unquote. But according to Justin, Satan didn't anticipate Christianity by looking into the future. He tried to copy from the ancient Hebrew prophets, and according to Justin, Satan misunderstood the prophets. Notice that Justin says that the devil has imitated prophecy. We can see that Justin doesn't really have the devil looking into the future to copy Christ at all. He has just imitated prophecy from the old prophets, according to Justin. So Zeitgeist is false when it says the devil had foresight. Also, the supposed resurrection of Dionysus is post-Christian and from the 2nd century. Justin was writing in the 2nd century, so he most likely was not referencing pre-Christian sources or belief, just current post-Christian belief. As for proof Justin was referencing Old Testament prophecy and not looking into the future, Justin writes, quote, "And these things were said to both among the Greeks and among all nations, where they, the demons, heard the prophets foretelling that Christ would specially be believed in, but that in hearing what was said by the prophets, they did not accurately understand it, but imitated what was said of our Christ. Like men who are in error, we will make plain." First Apology. Zeitgeist misunderstands Justin and doesn't apply proper context. They then bring up Joseph of the Old Testament saying, quote, "Joseph was a prototype for Jesus," and then proceed with listing supposed similarities. Let's examine their points. Miracle birth. Only in the story of Jesus is the birth by a virgin, and is the child considered divine. 12 brothers, 12 disciples. Zeitgeist plays word games to trick the viewer into believing there is an actual parallel. However, Joseph was one of 12 brothers, which means he only had 11 brothers, while Jesus had 12 disciples. Jesus was not one of of the number of disciples, while Joseph was one of the number of the brothers, so this is not a parallel. Sold for 20 and 30 pieces of silver. Judas did not sell Jesus, he betrayed him for a price. Joseph, on the other hand, was sold as a slave. Judah and Judas suggest a sale. As previously pointed out, Judas did not sell Jesus. In the story of Joseph, Joseph is sold as a slave. Such behavior is not scholarly, nor is it conducive to those who are looking for any kind of honest assessment. Work at the age of 30. Okay, this is completely false. Jesus did indeed begin his ministry at the age of 30, according to the New Testament, but Joseph began his work of predicting things through interpretations of dreams at 17, not 30. Again, zeitgeist is being deceitful. So if scholars were to use this line of criteria for evidence, I would make a prediction. Consider the following parallels between Lincoln and Kennedy. Abraham Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846, Kennedy in 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. The names Lincoln and Kennedy each contain 7 letters. Both of their wives lost their children while living in the White House. Both presidents were shot on a Friday. Both were shot in the head. Both were assassinated by Southerners. Both were succeeded by Southerners. Both successors were named Johnson. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, was born in 1908. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Both assassins were known by 3 names. Both names are comprised of 15 letters. Booth ran from a theater and was caught in a warehouse. Oswald ran from a warehouse and was caught in a theater. Booth and Oswald were assassinated before their trials. Before Lincoln was assassinated, he visited Marilyn Monroe. Before Kennedy was assassinated, he visited Marilyn Monroe. One can begin to understand why parallels have not persuaded the majority of today's scholars. Aside from Zeitgeist's parallels being wrong, parallels mean nothing. Zeitgeist then attacks the historicity of Jesus and the extra-biblical sources, where they make the false statement that only 4 sources are typically used. They list Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and Tacitus, and say they only say a few sentences at best. This is a false statement. Tacitus wrote a long statement on Jesus and Christians in the Annals. Tacitus not only referenced Jesus, but we can learn a lot from his writings. For example, Christians were named for their founder Christus, who was put to death by the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. His death ended the superstition for a short time, but it broke out again, especially in Judea, where the teaching had its origins. His followers carried out a doctrine to Rome. When the Great Fire destroyed a large part of the city during the reign of Nero, the emperor placed the blame on the Christians who lived in Rome. Tacitus reports that this group was hated for their abominations. These Christians were arrested after pleading guilty, and many were convicted for hatred for mankind. They were mocked and then tortured, including being nailed to crosses and burnt to death. Because of these actions, the people had compassion for the Christians. Tacitus therefore concluded that such punishment were not for the public good, but were simply to glut one man's cruelty. So Zeitgeist is being very deceitful when saying a few sentences at best, and it only references Christos, which is not Jesus. Obviously it is Jesus if you read Tacitus. They reference Suetonius. Suetonius writes, quote, "Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Christos, he expelled them from the city. After the great fire at Rome, punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief," unquote. From Suetonius we learn of the expulsion of the Jews from Rome, and that it was Christ who caused the Jews to make the uproar in Rome, apparently by his teachings. The second reference includes the use of the word mischievous to describe the group's beliefs, and the term Christians to identify this group as followers of the teachings of Christ. As for Pliny the Younger, his letter is so lengthy I have to summarize here. He states, quote, "They, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to God, and bound themselves by solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust, when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate, and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind," unquote. From Pliny's letter, we find several more facts about Jesus and early Christianity. Christ was worshipped as a deity by early believers. Pliny refers late in his letter to the teachings of Jesus and his followers as excessive superstition and contagious superstition. Jesus' ethical teachings are reflected in the oath taken by Christians never to be guilty of a number of sins mentioned in the letter. Concerning early Christianity, we see Pliny's method of dealing with believers, from their identification to their interrogation and to their execution. For those who denied being Christians, worship of the gods and emperor gained them their freedom. Pliny's inquiry received a reply which is published along with his letters. Although Emperor Trajan's response is much shorter, he states, quote, "The method you have pursued, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those denounced to you as Christians is extremely proper. It is not possible to lay down any general rule which can be applied as fixed standard in all the cases of this nature. No search should be made for these people. When they are denounced and found guilty, they must be punished, with the restriction, however, that when the party denies himself to be a Christian, and shall give proof that he is not, that is, by adoring our gods, he shall be pardoned on the ground of repentance, even though he may have formerly incurred suspicion. Informants without the accuser's name subscribed must not be admitted in evidence against anyone, as it is introducing a very dangerous precedent, and by no means agreeable to the spirit of the age," unquote. So when Zeitgeist says it's only a few sentences and it doesn't reference Jesus, they are way off base. In fact, if I were to read every passage about Jesus from outside sources, it would take a very long time. They bring up Josephus as being a forgery. There are good indications that the majority of the text is genuine. There is no textual evidence against it, and conversely, there is very good manuscript evidence for the statement about Jesus, thus making it difficult to ignore. The vast majority of Christian and atheist scholars conclude that Josephus did write about Jesus, not only in the brief statement concerning James, but also in the longer account. In 1972, Professor Shlomo Pines of Hebrew University in Jerusalem released a study on the Arabic manuscripts containing Josephus' statement about Jesus. It includes a different and briefer rendering of the entire passage. David Flusser of Hebrew University in Jerusalem stated, "It is quite plausible that none of the arguments against Josephus writing the original words even applies to the Arabic text, especially since the latter would have had less chance of being censored by the church." In addition, Flusser notes that an earmark of authenticity comes from the fact that the Arabic version omits the accusation that the Jews were to blame for Jesus' death, which is included in the original reading. James H. Charlesworth of Princeton concludes, quote, "We can now be as certain as historical research will presently allow that Josephus did refer to Jesus, providing corroboration of the gospel account," unquote. So no, Zeitgeist isn't up to date with modern scholarship on Josephus. We actually have around 42 sources for Jesus within 150 years of his life. Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, Thallus, Lucian, Marabar Serapion, Valentinius, Phlegon, the Gnostic Gospels, Celsus, Tertullian, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul's writings, Hebrews, Jude, and 1st and 2nd Peter. As Dr. Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona write, quote, "Tiberius Caesar was the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' ministry and execution. Tiberius is mentioned by 10 sources within 150 years of his death: Tacitus, Suetonius, Paterculus, Plutarch, Pliny the Elder, Strabo, Seneca, Valerius, Maximus, Josephus, and Luke. Compare that to Jesus' 42 total sources in the same length of time. That's more than 4 times the number of total sources who mention the Roman emperor during roughly the same period." In regard to those who gripe about the Gospels, historian Michael Grant writes, quote, "But above all, if we apply to the New Testament as we should, the same sort of criteria as we should apply to other ancient writings containing historical material, we can no more reject Jesus' existence than we can reject the existence of a mass of pagan personages whose reality as historical figures is never questioned," unquote. Now, nearly 100% of scholars, atheist and Christian, agree that Jesus lived. Most atheist scholars grant the crucifixion and empty tomb as well, such as Gerd Ludermann of Germany and many others. Only fringe scholars like Acharya S. and Herkamp say Jesus never existed, and as we have seen through films like Zeitgeist, they lie to get their message across. Of course, Acharya's and Zeitgeist's conspiracy theory would not be complete unless they point out the perpetrators. They need to show who is responsible for assembling all this information of pagan gods and astrological information from around the world. and explain how and when they met up to write the first ancient biblical manuscripts and started Christianity. In Acharya S.'s book, The Christ Conspiracy, she frantically insists it's the Masons. Now, I have studied Masonry and the New World Order thoroughly, debated the subject, arguing for a Masonic conspiracy which started in 1776, and even made a documentary film concerning it, so I absolutely know Acharya inside concedes there is no real physical data to support her outlandish theory that she proposes. So in her book on page 283, she asks herself, quote, "Where were these ubiquitous Masons when Christianity was being formed? Why is there so little mention in the texts of time? They certainly existed, as it was they who were erecting massive and magnificent edifices all over the globe. The Masons were there, perpetually hidden behind the scenes," unquote. So in other words, she has absolutely no evidence for her theory, and without this crucial part, the Christ conspiracy doesn't work. She provides no objective documentation that these supposed ancient Masons built all these massive structures in the world, or even existed at all in antiquity, and she is vague in describing which structures she is even referring to. If she means the pyramids, how would a few Masons be able to make a pyramid? Think about it. That would take thousands of people. Even with that many, we still have no idea how it is even possible to build the pyramids. She says the biblical Nimrod who built the Tower of Babel was considered the first Mason. But it doesn't matter if modern society or Freemasons say he was a Mason. You need data, and for that claim there is none. One must understand, all that Acharya is offering is legend. Masons have no proof Nimrod was the first Mason. He built a big tower that Masons imitate. So what? That doesn't prove he was a Freemason. All she can offer is quotes from fringe authors who have no evidence themselves, or quotes that don't even support her thesis. I contacted the historian and Freemason Rich Rodriguez and asked him the following questions. Is there any actual data that you are aware of that gives evidence for Nimrod actually being the first Freemason, as in he started the group, or is that just legend? Also, Hiram and the handshakes, is there any data that you know of that says the handshakes were actually done by him, or is that legend? Rich responded and simply said, quote, "It's all legend." So, although Acharya writes as if she is presenting fact, she is presenting nothing of the sort. Acharya cites Thomas Paine, Origins of Freemasonry, but the accepted term for hundreds of years was simply Masonry, or operative Masonry, because they were merely craftsmen and guildsmen. It wasn't until 1717 in London that they were even known as Freemasons. Some would say the late 16th century at the earliest. It was at this point Freemasonry allowed anyone to join, and not just craftsmen or guildsmen, as it had been previously. And it wasn't until 1776 that Freemasonry was involved with any big conspiracy. Adam Weishaupt and his order infiltrated Freemasonry. Before then, there was no Masonic conspiracy. The truth is, Masonry didn't start until 800 years ago, according to our data and the vast majority of historians and research. Only fringe authors like Acharya S. say otherwise. As for the Thomas Paine quote, he doesn't even say Masons created Christianity. He just gives his opinion on how he thinks both Masonry and Christianity are sun worship, which is illogical in and of itself. But he doesn't claim Masons created Christianity, as Acharya asserts. If the claim is that Christianity was based on sun worship, then how do you explain how the Jews went from sun worship to Jesus when sun worship was forbidden in Judaism? Then she quotes Higgins, saying, quote, "Every part of Christianity refers back to Abraham, and it's all Freemasonry," unquote. But Freemasonry didn't start until 1717, or at the earliest the 16th century, as noted by scholars. She claims that Jesus and Paul were Masons as proof, but she had just finished writing nearly 240 pages on how she thinks Jesus never existed. The inconsistency and illogic here is very evident. In the last paragraph of Acharya S.'s book, The Christ Conspiracy, she says, quote, "Despite the vilification, or in other words, slanderous defamation of the so-called New Age movement, the fact is we are entering into this new age. I am with you always to the close of the age," so ends the Gospel of Matthew. What does this mysterious statement mean? And why was this all-important book ended with it? The age referred to in the Gospel tale is that of Pisces, unquote. Now, it is abundantly evident that the whole purpose of Zeitgeist Part 1 and the Christ Conspiracy was to induct you into the New Age movement. Despite the total deconstruction of Acharya S. and her camp, They will continue to persuade the young generation to join their New Age brotherhood of mystery, study, learn, and help us overcome this trend of malicious lies put forth by the New Age movement.